Hi everyone. The point of this video is to give you a really basic idea of how to go about sketching graphs of the sine and cosine functions. And what we're going to look at especially is the parent functions y equals sine of x and y equals cosine of x. So in order to plot these graphs and the parent functions for y equals sine of x and y equals cosine x, be helpful to refer back to the values in the unit circle. And so here's this graphic that you've seen before. And we're going to plot the degrees, and what I've also put is the radians, because generally that's what you're going to be plotting on the x-axis is going to be the radian values. And I put the ones at pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, because those are going to be the most important points on the curve. And on the y-axis, we plot the value of sine or the value of cosine. So if I look at the sine values, here's 0, and at 0 the y value is 0, so we're at 0 when we make the plot. And then I go up to the top of the circle at pi over 2. There the sine value is 1, and that's where the maximum is, at pi over 2. And then I work my way down to pi. When I get to pi, I'm back at 0, or in the middle. And then I'm going to come down to the bottom of the circle. So that's going to be my minimum at -1 when I'm at 3 pi over 2. And then I go back to 0 in the middle at 2 pi. And if I were to keep going around further, this cycle would keep repeating. And that's why sine is known as a periodic function. Likewise, we know with cosine, cosine is the x value in the unit circle, and cosine values get larger as you move towards the right of the unit circle. So starting at 0, my cosine is the farthest to the right that it can be. So we're at our maximum value, or 1. As I move towards pi over 2, my x starts getting lower, which means my cosine starts getting lower, and it hits 0 at pi over 2. And then I come down the side, and I get to pi. So now I'm at -1. I'm the farthest to the left. That's my minimum value for cosine. And then I work my way back towards 0. And at 3 pi over 2, I'm back in the middle at 0. And then I go back to 2 pi, which puts me back at the right of the circle, or where the maximum x value is. So if we look at a graph of the parent function for y equals sine of x, from the unit circle we know that sine of 0 is 0, so that's going to be on our midline. And then we're going to go up to 1, so that'll be the maximum. Then we come back down to 0, that's our midline. We come all the way down to the minimum at -1, and then we go back to 0 at the midline, and then it's going to repeat in this pattern. So I'll go maximum, midline, minimum, midline. And then I can work my way backwards into the negative values, or if I were to go clockwise in the unit circle. So if I go back to the minimum, and then I go to the midline, and then I go to the maximum, and then I go to the midline. And it keeps repeating in that cycle. If I do y equals negative sine of x, it's still going to be cyclical and periodic, but since it's a reflection of y equals sine of x, the pattern's going to go from the midline, and then instead of going to the maximum first, it's going to go to the minimum at pi over 2, and then back to the midline, and then up to the maximum, and then back to the midline. And so the pattern goes just a little bit differently because this is going to be the reflection of y equals sine of x. So we'll use the same idea for plotting the graph of the cosine function, but we know that cosine of 0 is 1, so cosine's going to start the cycle at its maximum and then go to the midline, the minimum, the midline, and then back to the maximum. And then it just keeps going through that same cycle very similarly to what the sine function did. And with negative cosine of x, that's the reflection of y equals cosine of x. So instead of starting at its maximum, it's going to start at its minimum and then go to the midline, maximum, midline, minimum. And that's pretty much the main thing that you need to know as far as plotting the sines and the cosine functions. Both of these functions just go through the same cycle, and what you want to see on the graph is the pattern of it going through its minimums, maximums, and midlines and going all the way and completing a full cycle. So that should give you the main gist of what you're going to be looking at when you're plotting these sine and cosine functions. Obviously, like we did dozens of times in Algebra 2, we're going to be able to use our transformations of functions to do a bunch of different things with both the sine and the cosine graphs.